Welcome. This is the second session of day 2, and I'm kind of glad that Sriram opened today. He kind of spoke about a lot of what I wanted to kind of emphasize on. And so I've worked in the product space for the last 15 years of the 25 years that I've worked generally. And I've worked with startups. I've worked with a few larger companies. I've worked with Sandeep closely over the last couple of years in terms of kind of work, trying to kind of navigate and helping teams get from a very project and output mindset to a lot more product and outcome kind of a thinking. And Sandeep here, he's also been in this space for about 25 years. He's run his own startup and has been mainly focused on the product space, right? Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to try and weave a story through where Agile currently we've seen some of those implementations at, and how product managers could have an influence in taking them from like a little bit of an output focus into an outcome focus. I'm going to try and weave that story. I'm going to try and keep some of the examples intentionally vague because of non-disclosure, but I'm going to pick on some easily relatable examples along the way. Yeah. So starting off with the basics, right? One of the highest priorities in the Agile manifesto was like, hey, we need to kind of look at how we satisfy the customer through continuous delivery and make sure that the software that we're delivering is valuable. And I'm going to kind of, so one of the key essences that we kind of picked from this was like, hey, how do we kind of continuously deliver through shorter cycles? How do we ensure it is valuable through frequent customer feedback and figuring out how to adapt to this kind of a feedback that we're getting, right? So a lot of what we needed was flexibility through this whole process. However, one of the things that we saw, both Sandeep and I, during some of our customers that we worked with, was that there was a lot of very rigid upfront planning. They stacked up a lot of features on a quarterly basis, sometimes even on an annual basis. And it's only the delivery team that's working on an agile basis in 2-week sprints, and there's a lot of improvement happening on the test and deploy. But however, what ends up happening is it's mostly a waterfall kind of a process, which is kind of just bottled in an agile manner. And some of the key essences in terms of flexibility is lost along the way. So what we then started noticing was that a lot of the roadmap was being kind of directed by overconfident business leaders. Their intentions are clearly there in terms of kind of trying to make an impact in the outcome, but they seem to be kind of owning the discovery. They kind of end up dictating features, and product managers mostly kind of play a role of kind of translating these sort of business needs into requirements, and the feature teams end up focusing on how to prioritize, do a little bit of refining and implementing. And what they end up with is like a huge backlog of features, and they're constantly trying to figure out how to prioritize. So now this, we noticed that a lot of the focus of these enterprises then comes back to the engineering team, and they're trying to figure like, hey, how do we get them to prioritize or get things out faster? Whereas what we kind of wanted to try and push back was like, hey, prioritization, while it seems to be an execution problem, how do we add more people? It actually was a strategy issue. Like, hey, what do you really want to be focusing on? We can prioritize a backlog of 300 features, right? But you're never going to get to most of them. It's more important for the leadership and the VP of products to kind of figure out, hey, what is it that we want to really focus on, right? And that's one of the areas that both Sandeep and I started kind of working with the leadership on. So while on the one front, we have the agile metrics, we have say-do ratios, we have burn down charts, we have like things like velocity and change lead time that we do track around the delivery process. The key part around figuring out, hey, are we really satisfying the customer? And is the software that we're delivering, are the features that we're delivering actually being valued by the end user, was what was kind of missing. And we also try to kind of, through this process, get the business stakeholders to not play the role of dictating features and trying to be an internal stakeholder, and actually have the product managers go and start talking to the actual users of the product and be able to kind of start solving their need and start measuring and anchoring around that in terms of success. So I'll just kind of, so this has been one of the key things that we try to kind of crack, and we feel that this is pretty much the essence of the agile way of working, which is about saying that, hey, a lot of the focus has to be around trying to reduce waste. And we've kind of, just quoting Microsoft, who said like, hey, about 65 to 70% of the features that we deliver fail to improve the metric that they kind of try to improve, right? So this is not like a one-off problem, it's like a widespread problem. And what we really wanted to do through like kind of bringing back the product manager to the at the center of the whole equation and getting them to drive a lot of the work was around trying to say, hey, how do we get them to start building, to learn? How do we kind of get early customer feedback? How do we kind of get the feedback without having to build the whole feature and roll it out? How do you even get feedback after rolling out to see whether it's had like that kind of impact on the downstream impact that Sriram was talking about earlier, right? So this needed also for us to kind of go and work with the product teams to ensure that they iterate through some of the key ideas that they've built on. The first time around, they may not have hit the kind of adoption and traction metrics that they needed to see, but how do we kind of get them to then iterate through? So this is also another angle that we kind of try to attack. So if I'm looking at the kind of role a typical product manager plays, right? One part of it kind of starts off with like the product delivery, how you're speccing out a feature, how do you kind of ensure that hey, you're kind of writing out your PRDs, how you kind of detailing out what you want to see built. There's also a part around kind of making sure that hey, you're overseeing the delivery in terms of iteratively and then ensuring that hey, it's actually matching what you built. But there's also the work around trying to look through the data in terms of adoption metrics, in terms of what seems to be happening in your sphere of the product to see like, hey, where exactly are the kind of areas that we can influence. So you're going to look at what seems to be happening. If you're kind of in charge of, if you're looking at retention metrics, for example, you're going to look at what kind of flows. I'll come back to that in a little bit. I'll just kind of I'll talk about the metrics in a second, detail it out in a second. So we've got like these 2-3 roles that we want product managers to also kind of own in terms of the fluency with data, being able to kind of have active conversations with customers to see like, hey, why certain things seem to be happening, why are there drop-offs at certain stages, and being able to kind of then come up with hypotheses, come up with like potential solutions, and then being able to kind of go and test out some of these solutions and validate some of these solutions before they get implemented, right? So there's a two-pronged approach. One is on the delivery, where the focus is going to be on the predictability and quality, whereas there's also this part around discovery, where the focus is about like, hey, have you validated the problem? Does exist? Have you been able to kind of test out all the assumptions that you have around like some of the problems and maybe around some of the solutions? And also kind of looking at post rolling out a feature, have you been able to kind of measure the results, right? So on the product delivery front, one of the key things that we've kind of used, especially when teams come with large features, we've kind of seen that, hey, they end up having this whole build a large feature across like 3 or 4 different sprints and kind of having a big bang release. One of the useful ways to kind of avoid that has been to kind of create a story map and then kind of figure out how to slice it to kind of roll out the functionality iteratively and deliver value. So I've just kind of picked up an example of one of the startups that I'd worked with. So it was a fintech company trying to have a portal for enterprise stock options. And we had the flow around like where the admin would create a buyback program. There's a level of approval has to happen by the founders. Then you roll it out to employees who accept and reject. So there's a whole flow, and this is typically how a large features come up. And when we did this kind of sat down and spent like a few hours, maybe half a day in the beginning, talking through this and kind of mapping it out like this, one of the key things that happened was we realized that, hey, we had 56 smaller user stories trying to deliver something like this. And this is the true cost of how much has to get built started coming out. The second thing was also, when we started mapping it in 2 dimensions, rather than a single backlog of 56 user stories, these 2 dimensions kind of started telling us like, hey, it started giving us relative priority. We could talk about like, hey, the option to, I can't see this, but some of these things in terms of like sending out the 4-feature letter or like kind of connecting it to WhatsApp and a few of the other notifications were relatively lower priority, and we could kind of figure out what was the absolute minimum to kind of have this functionality rolling out and people to be able to see value, and then we can iteratively develop on top of that, right? So this kind of so building it out like this, a map, readjusting based on priority and being able to slice across to kind of say, hey, our MVP slice will be ensuring we can do most of the things. We probably avoid certain kind of workflows for now, but being able to slice this horizontally started making sure we could kind of deliver it and then iterate through it continuously, right? So this is how we started kind of helping the team with kind of enabling them to kind of do delivery iteratively. But this also had another, like this still didn't address one of the root cause, another issue that we kind of were looking at, which was when we roll out some of these features, if you've not actually validated the need, users still don't end up using the product. We see this a few months later that, hey, nobody's still using the product. We go back and start asking like, hey, what's missing in terms of the features? And they kind of tell us a bunch of features. We start building it. And then once we build it, we still haven't validated a lot of this. So this was a scenario where we've had customers over a period of a few months ending up having hundreds of features in the backlog, right? And they're kind of continuously trying to deliver, but they're not able to see the intended impact that they wanted to have, right? So this happens because like, hey, teams focusing mainly on shipping the features, including the product managers. So they're mostly working with like the user design folks and like with the tech folks to kind of deliver the features rather than delivering the real customer value. So I'm just going to now kind of switch into talking about how we can potentially address it, right? So there's a lot of pressure from the stakeholders to ship. There's a lack of clear strategy between like, hey, what are the company goals and what are the product initiatives that we're running? And a lot of the incentives also were kind of tied around shipping on time and not solving the underlying problems. So with this, right, like one of the things that we want to try and drive was, while we're measuring a lot of the agile metrics in terms of like say-do ratios and burn downs and velocities and the lead times, one of the key things we wanted to kind of address was like, hey, that speed is not going to be adequate. It's going to be sufficient. It's not going to be adequate. It's necessary, but it's not going to be adequate. We're also going to need to know the direction in which we want to head, and that's when you're going to be able to measure progress, right? So earlier yesterday, right, Naresh? Yeah, you'd spoken about how getting the speed is like one of the fundamental necessary foundations on which we could then build up on actually making the progress, right? So one of the things that we wanted to then focus the product managers on was, hey, how are you going to start measuring this progress, right? And against what kind of a higher order goals are we kind of trying to measure around, right? So one of the key things that we started doing there was talking to like the leadership to say that, hey, the strategy that you're coming up with should not be just like a list of features and on a roadmap. We want to be able to kind of have you talk about what kind of goals and outcomes you want to set for teams to kind of be able to kind of align around some of these business outcomes. I'm going to pick up an example that will make it a little clearer soon. The other thing was even the product operations, right? Rather than just kind of looking at on the solution and kind of designing out, we started working with the product teams to kind of tell them, hey, how do we get you to kind of start looking at exploring the problem? How do you measure and start measuring that and putting that part of your workflows in terms of as part of justifying it and anchoring them around the problem space, around the user needs, pain points, and desires, and validating both the problems and the solutions before building it out. So this then we went into kind of also saying that, hey, post rolling it out, shipping was not where we kind of called it, looked at success. We also wanted to kind of have even measures in terms of what kind of business metrics we were trying to move, and use multiple types of testing like cohorts and A/B testing and multivariate testing. So this cohorts and A/B testing, I've been able to kind of successfully do it with some of the startups, but the larger organizations found it quite difficult to kind of roll out A/B testing. We had kind of built out the feature toggle also specifically around that, right? Yeah. So now with this, the few steps that we'd want to kind of take to kind of get there was first to kind of get the product leadership to connect few things around the strategy to business outcomes. These typically would be lagging indicators like even retention or renewal rates and a few of those sort of things. We then wanted like the VP of product or the head of product working with PMs to arrive at product outcomes, and these would be leading indicators that predict these sort of business outcomes. I'll kind of come up with an example that would make that a little more easier to understand. And then we've got product teams that then deliver and prioritize these opportunities to influence these product outcomes. So this would be like a quarterly exercise that we want like the head of product defining certain key business outcomes that they wanted to kind of go after. We've got like PMs then coming back with their understanding of their domain to kind of say, hey, what kind of product outcomes can influence these sort of business outcomes? And then they're going after like, hey, what kind of opportunities exist in terms of the pain points and from the data that they've seen and the kind of kind of conversations that they've been having with the customers, right? So through that, they go then, and once they validate the problem, they go and start exploring solutions, testing out some of the assumptions underlying some of these solutions, before they go ahead and implement. So this part has to happen before we kind of have the development team actually going ahead and investing a lot of time building some of these things, right? So with this, one of the things that kind of helps the teams understand what to do would be like the kind of, what kind of game are you playing, right? For example, it could be the attention game in terms of what the Instagrams and the TikToks do, in terms of getting people to kind of, in terms of getting users to kind of use the platform and stick around for as long as possible in terms of session times. So a lot of the key metrics would be like, hey, what are your daily, weekly, and monthly return rates, and how long are people sticking around in this case. You also have like certain tools like Slack, Notion, and Salesforce is mostly about productivity, and here you're looking at a longer term retention, saying that, hey, if people have been using the platform, are they renewing every 3 months, 6 months? You've got like even transaction games in terms of like marketplaces, and where you go and try and drive purchases, where you're looking at conversion rates and the acquisition costs and average order values and stuff like that, right? So with an example, I'm going to try and stitch a few of these things together and then go into the next step. So for example, if you look at like an online education platform like Udemy, they go through some parts of what I've kind of called out as part of the transaction game. They're trying to get you to buy like either a trial or a paid version. And then after that, they're going to try and then kind of hold on to your attention in terms of the how long you're going to continue a session and come back. So you land on the page, you discover something that you like, you probably then sign up and evaluate and try out the trial period for a few days or weeks. And then at some point, you're going to try and convert into a paid user. So this kind of an example, right? Typically, you would take all the elements. So you've got like dozens of elements around, right? There's going to be cart, login, sign up, pricing, business, different types of courses that you have. All of these are typically all the kind of UI elements that you have on the site. You're going to try and then have different product teams under you as a VP, looking at like, hey, different stages in terms of how people land on the site, discover something. They look at like, hey, previewing a course, they search through some of the courses that they're looking for, either while browsing or through categories or through searches. They go and evaluate some of those courses over a few weeks, and some of them are going to try and, you're going to try and convince them to purchase and sign up, right? So this is typically how you'd look at a large product being managed across multiple different product managers, and you'd have a VP probably kind of overseeing this, or a director of product. And this kind of a flow typically then makes it easier for you to then start looking at what kind of metrics you want to track. For example, as a business leader, the VP of product would say like, hey, our daily active users have to kind of go up. You'd have like one of the product managers typically who's been in that space working on that particular segment for a few quarters, being confident enough to be able to then say that, hey, I'm going to take a hypothesis, I'm going to take a bet that, hey, the course preview watch time, the more time they spend on it, on previewing courses, the higher the likelihood of enrolling. So what happens is, I as a VP of product, I'm able to kind of take what our overall mission is. Is it growth? Is it retention? Is it like getting people to come back to the platform depending on where we are at in terms of size? I'm going to be able to set that kind of an overall, translate that kind of a strategy into this sort of business outcomes that I want to go after. I'm going to then have those conversations with my product managers. I'm going to give them that time to be able to kind of get comfortable and familiar with their systems, to be able to then start taking these sort of calls, right? So this is where your OKRs and all start emerging, saying that, hey, I'm setting an objective of kind of trying to drive this, but I'm using this as a leading indicator to be able to kind of say, hey, this is the connection I'm going to make. So like Sriram was mentioning earlier, there's going to be proximate impact and there's going to be downstream impact, right? So that kind of maps to around saying that, hey, these are the proximate impacts that I can start measuring. The fact that, hey, I'm going to get to make interventions, like make it really easy, autoplay the next session, like next preview. Those sort of kind of minor interventions that I'll introduce to say, I'm going to try and increase the mean time spent watching some of these previews in the hope that that connects back to the lagging metric around daily active users, right? Because some of these daily active users, it's lagging because it's mostly after the fact kind of measures, right? And you want to kind of now anchor around some of the leading indicators, because you can run an experiment, you can start seeing the effect a lot closer, you can start measuring, and then through experience, you're going to start connecting these leading metrics to the kind of lagging metrics that you want to try and drive. Cool. So that's the kind of play that happens here. So even with retention rate, right, you're going to have like a product manager who's going to say that, hey, the better the, I mean, seems obvious, like ensuring that, hey, the search to click ratios in terms of saying that, hey, the more relevant our searches are, the chances that they click on something that they were looking for and they return is much higher, and that will kind of eventually kind of drive the retention rates, right? So that's another kind of a conversation that the PMs and the VP of products would have. And similarly with activation rates, you have number of enrolled courses during trial being like a indicator of higher conversion to paid, right? So these are the kind of examples that would, we would expect the product managers and the VP of products kind of having prior to kind of committing to what they want to go after for the next quarter. And these are some of the conversations that we probably want to try and facilitate for these product managers, right? So is another example in terms of like conversion could also mean like, hey, how do I kind of get more people to add courses to their cart as an indicator that, hey, the higher likelihood of them purchasing a paid version of the product, right? So these sort of examples exist across most organizations. I feel like this is where you start giving a lot more power back to the product managers in terms of, hey, they can kind of start controlling these sort of variables through experiments and do these rapidly, right? You want them to be able to do them like over the course of a few days, few weeks, rather than waiting for 3 months to see like a lagging metric that could show up. And over a period of a few quarters, they're going to get better at it. And that's the kind of a process that you want product managers to go through to be able to kind of get more comfortable trying to take these calls of influencing the leading indicators in the hope of kind of being able to kind of drive the lagging indicator. So I'm going to try and see if I can quickly spin up. Yeah. So one of the things that I've also been really keen for product managers to try out have been some of these new developer environments. Cursor, Bolt, and Replit, Lovable, they've all been really phenomenal. It's blown my mind over the last few weeks in terms of how fast and well you can do it. I was just trying to spin up like a sandbox earlier in the morning today, and I was trying to kind of create let me just see if I can spin up the preview really quick and show you guys how this could potentially work. Right, so I've just kind of spun up a Udemy kind of like a mock-up site saying, hey, here's an edu flow, there's top categories featured, and I can do this all with like a couple of prompts saying that, hey, I just had to say Udemy clone and said he's going to create this along with a hero section and all of these things, right? This takes a few seconds. It's unbelievable what power this kind of gives, because now suddenly when I'm kind of talking about like, hey, going and kind of validating some of your solutions, right? Not the problem space. The problem space still means you're going to look at numbers, you're going to then go and have conversations to kind of get the what and the why. But once you start having some ideas around what you could do, you have tools like this which could quickly kind of spin up prototypes, right? And you can have like things like add number of votes next to the star rating, right? So something as simple as this. I'm going to take a couple of seconds, hold on. It starts spinning up code as we speak, right? And this is amazing because what used to be otherwise like quite a hard job for product managers to convince their UX team and the developers to kind of do some of this work becomes so much easier. Like as product managers, we have to be a lot more like individual in terms of our contributions, being able to do all of this validation really fast. I feel like a lot of these tools are still probably, it's questionable in terms of how good quality in terms of production ready code it is. I think it's almost there, but it's definitely ready in terms of what product managers can do, right? And if you see, right, like you can see 12,560 votes on 4.8, right? I can also say add an AI course as the main featured course, right? So these sort of things make it like super easy for us to have clickable prototypes that make it easy for us to kind of try some of these in-person kind of testing. We can add like pop-up modes to kind of say, hey, do you want to have a free trial? All of these sort of things kind of make it easier for us to kind of see how do we get people to go from just browsing the site to kind of signing up for a free trial and getting a 30-day free trial, you know? So all of these things, yeah. Look at this. There's a free course on artificial intelligence and machine learning masterclass, right? So I can make it like a full width, I can make it narrow, and it becomes super easy for me to even share it and try it out on mobile, all of this stuff, right? So there's an image missing, but essentially you get the, I could spend like a lot more time trying to walk through all of these, but essentially this is the kind of power that I'm hoping most product managers would start using to kind of be able to do a lot of the solution side validations really early on without needing heavy lifting from the development team. So yeah, so on that note, right, like this, something like this would be a good way for us to capture a lot of what the features have been able to deliver in terms of outcomes. So on the one front, if you look at the x-axis, right, in terms of how long features have taken, you could kind of look at all the features that have been delivered over the last quarter. You can kind of, we try to line them up in terms of a feature scorecard, and we did this with one of the teams primarily to showcase like how a lot of the features that got delivered in the last quarter didn't seem to hit their target, right? And we were not surprised because we were expecting 60-70% to not hit the target, but our leadership team was actively engaged, right, Sandeep, in terms of then to say that, hey, how do we now kind of put some measures in place in advance? So on the one front, you would kind of look at measuring these features in terms of the quality, in terms of bugs and budgets. You can kind of indicate and saying that, hey, did it make it on time and on budget? And you start, one of the patterns that you'd see is like larger features always end up having a lot more hidden complexities that kind of causes scope to really creep on one side. But however, the more important part was having this up there and a VP of product and product manager sitting on the features that we recently delivered, and then talking about the y-axis, right? Hey, did we hit the kind of like uptake and the kind of outcomes that we want to hit, the leading indicators, and then maybe after a quarter, even the lagging indicators in terms of retention, right? What kind of like cohort testing and A/B testing were we able to do to kind of drive that, right? So this then kind of tells us like, hey, the kind of conversations the VP would have is like, hey, was that feature even adequately discoverable for people, for the users, were there adequate adoption levels, all the proximate metrics, and the long-term downstream metrics in terms of like, hey, what kind of business impact did it have, right? So with this, a lot of the discussion then starts moving into like, hey, are there better ways to measure, right? We've all of this is journey. There's no like a single easy kind of a stuck, like a paint by numbers kind of a way to kind of start saying, how do you measure? This is a conversation that you have in the context of your product between the VPs and the product managers. We help them evolve quarter on quarter. So this becomes like a nice place to start having those conversations. Once in a fortnight, you kind of start saying that, hey, how do you measure like if this feature has been adopted? How do you measure like how is it connected with like the kind of leading metrics we want to have in terms of, or the lagging metrics in terms of retention and a few of those other things, right? So how do we also try and improve the outcome? There are some features obviously were great ideas, which is why it got picked up last quarter. It's important for them to start figuring out, hey, can we improve the outcome? Some of those features, even after delivery, have not really hit the kind of outcome. We start kind of saying, hey, how do we kind of get them to start moving up to a place that we're going to be saying that is acceptable in terms of the business impact, right? So this also gives a chance for us to kind of get product managers to kind of have those conversations with VPs to say, hey, we'll go back and iterate through some of these features and be able to kind of say that, hey, how do we move the metrics on it in terms of adoption and in terms of like kind of driving the business outcomes that we have. And some of the conversations here also kind of go back from like just purely solution space into the problem space, because we kind of have these conversations saying that, hey, you've probably, based on your best understanding of the problem space, this is the kind of solution that we thought would work. And if it hasn't worked, do we need to revisit the problem space before we go and just kind of try another tactic to kind of fix the solution space? So these are the kind of conversations that product managers and product owners, VPs of products can have. And it's interesting because it also kind of, we give the space and the freedom to the product managers to try these experiments, but also hold them accountable in terms of the kind of outcomes that we want to hit, right? So this almost runs asynchronously outside of like the pure delivery kind of conversations that you're going to have, right? So this also kind of ensures like, hey, we keep the actual effort and the outcome visible. We start seeing like, hey, some of these features have taken far longer than we expected to take. It's costed us a lot more time. And at the same time, like, hey, has it been able to hit the kind of outcomes that we want to hit? Yeah. Yeah. So, yes, so overall, I think we've been trying to kind of drive home the need for being able to question before you go out and try and figure out how to solve it. get actual users talking rather than internal stakeholders who try and represent some of the users. We also kind of want to ensure that, hey, the bug doesn't stop at just shipping these features. You want to kind of actually see whether it's solving for the customer needs, or some kind of needs or pain points are getting addressed, which kind of have the kind of impact, downstream impact that we wanted. And a lot of the backlog we start viewing them as experiments. We're not going to look at it as just like a definite, like the roadmaps typically with a bunch of features used to kind of convey a sense of confidence that, hey, we're going to be able to hit the kind of outcomes. When you kind of change it around to say that, hey, these are going to be experiments, it feels more like we're going to test out all of these things and figure out whether it's landing before we kind of go ahead and build it out. So these are the few things that we've kind of learned from some of the work that we've done. Sandeep, you want to add anything else? Yeah. Any questions? I think I've tried to convert like what we do usually as a 3-day workshop or longer into 45 minutes. I skim through a lot of stuff. I may have kind of not connected some of the dots properly. Happy to take some questions and even detail out some things later.
Anyone has a question?
Stunned silence, okay.
Thank you. I think it was a wonderful session. So much to take away, as you were saying. Yeah. One interesting thing that I was interested to know is in the initial part you spoke about, how you have these conversations with VPs of products on lagging metrics and how we could then convert them into some of the leading indicators. Mm-hmm. So could you maybe talk about some of your experiences where it has, you had to really inspect and adapt some of those metrics and had to change them, what they were currently measuring? Because some of the things that you're currently measuring, I think when you consult them, you would tell them that, you could have done things differently, and what were some of the reactions that you got and how you were able to navigate that? Because one of the things that we all face is how to make sure that, we get into that path of measuring the right metrics.
It's a nice question. Thanks, Parul, right? So one of the issues that I had seen personally working with the startup, we can probably talk about some of the enterprise examples also. But one of the startups that I had worked with, the founders were kind of mostly leading the product direction, and they did not have any measures in place. So even kind of talking about like, hey, why are certain features being built? Like, why is that ESOP buyback option being built? And what kind of an outcome that you want to try and hit itself was a start of a conversation. And it gets hard because you need to kind of tread carefully. You don't want to kind of sound like you're questioning them. They do have a distortion field around what they believe, and sometimes they're not going to have ready answers. And sometimes it's part art and part like, hey, how do we kind of get the rest of the team to kind of now align? How do we measure against this? Because we want to learn and iterate is the conversation that ends up happening.
So are you using any tool?
For?
Tool or framework for having those kind of conversations, asking the right questions right now?
Correct. So we start with that, hey, what's your play at, right? Like, are you trying the attention game? Are you trying the transaction game? And then from there, try and work through. Like, if you look at that ESOP buyback, right? That was a productivity game. It's a SaaS platform. You're trying to get admins to be able to do the work. What used to happen offline and sending out 50 offer letters used to happen at the click of a button, right? So those are the kind of conversations we have and try and measure that. Yeah. So, okay.
Hey, Cliff, you want to talk a little bit about the product trap and what suggestions you might have for teams to maybe specifically, I think we talked about a few different options here. Yeah. So, want to touch upon that a little bit?
Thanks, Naresh. On the product trap, right? So there are 2-3 parts to this. What ends up happening when you do not have like a clear strategy or an actionable strategy is that the roadmap gets filled with like the loudest voice in the building, right? Like the sales team or like the fear of competition catching up, trying to kind of fill up your backlog. So that's when you're kind of always racing against this. That's when the backlog gets really crowded because you're trying to go in multiple different directions. So the question really comes back to like, hey, can the founders sit down and say, hey, what's the bet that we're going to try and take, right? And you don't want them, like the strategy can evolve. It doesn't completely change usually, but it can evolve quarter on quarter. But you want that strategy to kind of inform the team in terms of what kind of metrics that we want to kind of move, more than kind of saying what features we want to develop. So then you're having that feel that, hey, a lot of these sort of conversations kind of start translating into saying that, hey, rather than asking customers what features are missing, right? You're going back and saying, hey, what behaviors we want to see, how are we going to measure that, and if by influencing that, what kind of outcomes are we going to hit? And those outcomes is what kind of starts get defined by the senior management more than them dictating features as internal stakeholders. It's a bit complicated, but yeah, that's
I think
probably where we need to strike it.
What we were discussing the other day in terms of like what you could do is you could say this is what we have to offer and try and look at finding a segment to whom it will appeal and not like keep building more stuff, right?
Yeah.
So that's one approach out of this where you kind of stick to what you already have rather than just keep asking people what is missing and keep building that, right?
Correct.
So you're maybe trying to find the right segment, or the early adopters in some case, right?
Yeah.
Also depending on what stage of your product evolution you are in, right? Are you really early stage trying to find a product market fit? Are you at a stage where you've proved the product market fit with, let's say, 3-4 customers, and now you're at the scale and you're trying to look for the early majority, right?
Correct.
And depending on that, maybe there will be different strategies you could use to break out of.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, a lot of the strategy gets informed by like your external forces. So, and a lot of my focus today has been like, hey, once you've kind of got that insight, how do you align the rest of the team around those key strategic insights so you can pack a punch so everybody's coordinated. But you're very right, like looking at like Jeffrey Moore's that crossing the chasm, right? To see like, hey, are you looking at early adoption, trying to get a few design partners to work with, versus like actually trying to go after the pragmatists who are going to be a lot more guarded in terms of how they spend their time and money and how we're going to convince them. So the kind of play would be very different. But again, that's like the strategy is I find it hard to working with some of the companies with this strategy, but yes.
One question that keeps coming up actually, so probably a question that's been asked multiple times, but what would be some of the essential product metrics that you would suggest that product managers need to focus on? Obviously, it's very product specific, etc., but there's a framework.
So that's actually an interesting one, because I'll just try and pick up something that Dan Olson had put in sometime. It depends on what kind of stage your product is at. Okay? So it could be like a very early startup, and like something like what Naresh is trying to do with Specmatic, right? You're going to not have you're going to have a lot more exploratory style metrics where you're kind of trying to see whether a certain idea is going to stick. Sorry, I'm just going to try and get there. But whereas when you're going from like having proven an MVP and then you're trying to kind of get a product market fit, right? That's when you're doing a lot more iterations. So 80-90% is iteration. And then once you hit your product market fit is when you're going to go after growth. And that's when you're looking at like a lot more of the infrastructure and those sort of scalability kind of metrics that you want to try. So I think that the product managers mostly play in the product market fit and further fine tuning it. And it's the founders who are playing at the MVP kind of stages where a lot more innovation metrics come in. So there's a lot more intuition at play, and you're kind of trying to find like early stages of how you're going to try and validate some of your early ideas. The same thing happens even in a large enterprise when you're trying to come up with a new idea. So it's not easy to kind of account for like, hey, have you been able to move certain metrics at very early stages? So you want to break the mold and give them that space. But at some point when they've kind of been able to prove the initial idea, you go after the iteration metrics. But that's again a little longer conversation. I'll try and just pull up this stuff that I didn't want to pull. Yeah, in terms of kind of going from an MVP to a PM product market fit stage to growth, this is again, Ben Foster was kind of spoken about this in Build What Matters. And he talks about like, hey, how 90% is innovation from the 0 to MVP stage. And after that, most of the work kind of comes into the iteration phase for the MVP to PM product market fit, right? You have an idea of building a sleep app. But then are you building it for an older lady who needs to get up three times a night versus a pregnant woman who's kind of, or a young mother who's having to wake up. So you start figuring out how to fit it in for specific users, and that's when the user persona starts emerging and building for them kind of starts coming. Again, like I'm just touching upon a lot of different terms, but yeah.
Any more questions?
Cool.
Well, It was a great session. Thanks, Clifford and Sandeep.